2 decades ago, productivity gains in the Australian workplace were the envy of the developed world, playing a key role in boosting living standards and down the track helping to protect the economy from the worst ravages of the GFC. Now, while the Australian economy is a world beater in some ways, it's an also-ran now in productivity, which has swung dramatically into reverse over the past 5 years. It might not create many headlines, but it is a big problem. As Nobel laureate Paul Krugman famously put it, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's nearly everything. Neil Woolrich reports.
In a bustling factory outside Melbourne, workers are putting the finishing touches on a range of lights and navigation aids. They're supplying the global aviation and marine industries in a highly competitive business that's exposed to the vagaries of international currency markets.
With those factors, it makes it tough to get the products to the market at the price that we're happy with our margins at. So the only way that we can get there is to operate more efficiently than our competitors.
Chris Proctor says Sealight's operations aren't big enough to justify outsourcing, so they've brought many functions in-house in a bid to further boost the firm's efficiency.
We've set up our own tool-making facility, we've set up our own injection moulding plant. We do all of our hardware and software in-house, and through those things we can be more efficient at the release and the development of new products.
In other words, productivity gains. It's an issue that's been a key focus for Ken Henry over 2 decades as one of the nation's top economic mandarins.
Even though it's my last public address, there's yet time to get sacked.
In a valedictory speech in Hobart on Friday, the outgoing Secretary of the Treasury fired a few more parting shots. Dr Henry warns that riches from the mining boom might have lulled politicians and the public into a false sense of security about economic reform.
There is, I think, a sense of complacency in the broader community that hasn't put the political system under as much stress as it felt itself under in the 1980s.
And across at the Reserve Bank, Glenn Stevens also recently highlighted the need for productivity reforms, especially in industries like manufacturing.
When you think about those sectors, their prices are going to be squeezed by a high exchange rate, and their costs might well be under upward pressure as the resource sector and other parts of the economy increase demand for labour and capital.
However, while the nation's top economic bureaucrats continue to bang the productivity drum, it seems few in Canberra are listening.
The commodities boom will end at some point, and when it does, if we haven't improved our productivity performance, then the outlook for Australia's economy from that point onwards might be uncomfortably like what we experienced between the mid-1970s and the early 1990s.
Indeed, Australia's productivity growth barely topped 1.5% during the 1980s, but it climbed to nearly 3% in the 90s before slipping back to around 1% in the last few years.
Labour market deregulation, financial market deregulation, and tariff reform, for example. There were some fairly specific policy initiatives, and although some of those were actually even made in the 80s, I think the late 80s, by the time the economy started to recover in the 90s, some of those benefits really started flowing through.
The Federal Treasurer, Wayne Swan, is aiming for productivity growth of 2% per annum. But this week, the national accounts showed that target was well and truly missed. GDP per hours worked rose by less than 1%. In other words, productivity growth would need to double to reach the Treasurer's self-imposed KPI. Greg Evans from the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry says Australia's productivity challenge will only become harder once a carbon tax is introduced.
We're about to see energy prices become a whole lot more expensive as a result of carbon pricing, and that will actually skew investment away from cheap and reliable power to much more expensive and unreliable forms of energy such as renewables and also gas-fired generations.
The next wave of productivity reform may well prove to be the most difficult because it's in areas where politicians are loath to interfere. Both major parties have all but ruled out a return to more hardline industrial relations policies. And some industries seem to be untouchable when it comes to competition, such as news agencies, pharmacies, and a handful of professions like medicine and the law.
There's really been no genuinely productivity-enhancing reform since the turn of the decade. That's partly because, with the economy having done so well, there hasn't been the same political imperative to pursue productivity-enhancing reforms as there was during the 1990s.
And Saul Eslake argues that lawmakers at all levels have been too ready to impose a raft of productivity-stifling reforms.
There's been an increasing trend on the part of governments, responding to an increasing belief on the part of the public at large, that whenever something bad happens, be it terrorist attacks, be it a corporate collapse, be it a series of road accidents, governments can and should pass laws that prevent those things ever from being repeated.
What we want our businesses and firms running their business and not managing the compliance burden imposed by government.
It took us almost 9 months to connect power to our new tool room, and that was purely the bureaucracy that we were exposed with in getting the equipment, the infrastructure, and then the power turned on. It was an awful process.
Business is calling for tax and labour market reform and ways to promote a seamless economy between governments. Technology will play its part in improving Australia's productivity, and companies like Microsoft hope to be at the forefront of any change.
What we do is innovation and productivity. Those are the two elements that create competitive advantages. How do we create products that other companies don't think about? And how do we execute and go to market more efficiently than others?
But the most recent figures show that Australia is becoming slower to adopt new technology compared to other nations. That's another reason why some are warning of a return to the lacklustre economic performance of the late 80s and early 90s.
The challenges to date have not commanded the sense of urgency that I recall from earlier periods, particularly in the 1980s.
While Australia is a long way from the days when Paul Keating warned of a banana republic, the nation still faces a harsh reality check if, or perhaps more correctly when, the mining boom is over.